When the Ukraine war began, many in the West assumed that India would eventually align itself clearly with one camp, impose sanctions, downgrade ties with Russia, and follow the broader Western response. That assumption, however, reveals something deeper. The issue was not about Ukraine or Russia alone, it was about how India is often viewed and misunderstood in global politics. India's foreign policy has never been driven by alignment for its own sake. From the very beginning, India pursued an independent path, not isolation, but autonomy. This approach, often described as strategic autonomy, means that India shapes both its domestic and external policies based on national interest rather than alliance pressure. During the Cold War, this approach took the form of non alignment. Today, in a very different global environment, it has evolved into multi alignment. India does not stay equidistant from everyone, nor does it attach itself permanently to any one power bloc. Instead, it engages widely and selectively. This is why India can be a member of BRICS, engaging emerging economies, part of the Quad, working with the US, Japan, and Australia in the Indo Pacific, host and participant in the G20, shaping global economic discussions, and also active in regional groupings like BIMSTEC. These memberships are not contradictions, they are expressions of the same strategic logic: flexibility, balance, and independence. India avoids formal military alliances, but it does not avoid partnerships. It has built a wide network of relationships based on mutual benefit, trust, and cooperation. With the United States, India works on technology, defense cooperation, and the Indo Pacific. With Europe, it engages on trade, climate, and connectivity. With Russia, it maintains long standing ties in defense and energy. And with the global south, India positions itself as a development partner and diplomatic bridge. At the core of this approach are a few consistent principles: support for dialogue and engagement, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, and a preference for peaceful resolution of disputes. These principles explain many of India's diplomatic positions, including those that have frustrated Western policymakers. The Ukraine conflict became a moment where these differences surfaced clearly. When Western countries imposed sanctions on Russia, India chose not to join them. This decision was widely interpreted as moral ambiguity or silent support for Moscow. But that reading ignores key realities. First, the sanctions were not mandated by the United Nations. They were Western led political instruments. Second, India did not provide military support to Russia, nor did it endorse the invasion. What India did was protect its economic interests, particularly energy security. With a population of over 1.4 billion people, controlling inflation and ensuring affordable energy is not a choice, but a responsibility. Purchasing discounted Russian oil was a pragmatic decision, not an ideological one. India consistently called for dialogue, de escalation, and a diplomatic solution. It spoke to Moscow and Kiev alike. This was not neutrality in the traditional sense, but an attempt to keep channels open in a polarized environment. Part of the misunderstanding lies in expectations, particularly in parts of Europe. There is still, at times, an assumption that global consensus should naturally follow European priorities. India's External Affairs Minister, S. Jaishankar, addressed this directly when he remarked that Europe often assumes Europe's problems are the world's problems, while the world's problems are not always Europe's concerns. This is not a rejection of Europe, but a reflection of a changing global order. Today's world is increasingly multipolar. Power is more distributed, and emerging states like India have greater room and greater responsibility to define their own policy frameworks. This multipolar reality also exposes uncomfortable inconsistencies. While India was criticized for energy trade with Russia, Western economies themselves maintained selective economic engagements. Nuclear fuel, fertilizers, and certain energy transactions continued under exemptions. At the same time, the United States threatened India with sanctions for purchasing Russian defense systems, even as waivers were granted elsewhere when strategic interests demanded flexibility. These are not moral failures or conspiracies. They are reminders that international politics often operates through selective enforcement rather than absolute principles. India's foreign policy must be understood in this context. It is not anti West. It is not pro Russia, and it is not neutral in the simplistic sense. It is issue based, interest driven, and context specific. India's participation in BRICS, the Quad, the G20, and regional groupings like BIMSTEC reflects a country navigating a complex world without surrendering decision making authority. It reflects a belief that engagement does not require submission and partnership does not mean obedience. To understand India, the West must move beyond Cold War lenses and alliance expectations. Strategic autonomy is not indecision. In a multipolar world, it is a rational response to complexity. And perhaps that is the real reason India is often misunderstood. Not because its choices are unclear, but because they do not fit neatly into old geopolitical categories.